Angela Merkel is set to leave her position as German chancellor after more than a decade and a half. And while some applaud her political style in Europe, others see a lack of bold leadership. What do Europeans expect from a post-Merkel Germany? As world events have changed and unfolded, Merkel has had to deal with the Eurozone debt crisis, the migrant influx, and most recently, the pandemic. Where will Germany stand in Europe after Merkel? And will she be missed? Hello there, welcome to Roundtable. As Europe eagerly awaits the German election results, how will Merkel's successor manage Germany's role in the EU? And will the power dynamic in the bloc change? Angela Merkel came into power in 2005, making her one of the longest-serving chancellors in the history of the Federal Republic. As she prepares to leave the front line of politics, many in Europe are desperate to know how the outcome of the elections will impact the future of the European Union. Merkel's been accused of causing divisions within the EU, especially during the financial crisis, the migration crisis, and by its support for the Nord Stream pipeline. Yet, despite this, a survey published by the European Council on Foreign Relations found that many across Europe would support her taking a leading role in the EU. So what does Merkel stepping down mean for the future of Europe? And can her successor meet Europe's challenges ahead? Well, joining us on Roundtable today, we have Stefan Collignon, Professor of European Political Economy at the London School of Economics. In Munich, Germany, we have Ursula Munch, the Director of the Academy for Political Education in Tutzing, and we have Matthew Qvortrup, author of Angela Merkel, Europe's most influential leader. Good to have all of you with me. So Angela Merkel, she's seen as trustworthy, reassuring, competent, been very popular at home. Has she been a success in European politics? Stefan, what's your view? What's Merkel's legacy in the EU?
I think it's a good thing for Europe that she's going. I think she has been highly esteemed because she has been around for so long. But in reality, she's been pretty disastrous for Europe. She has been a brake on many developments. She has pushed Europe several times close to the brink of breakup, for example, during the Greek crisis. However, in the recent times, she has also, in view of the coalition partners she has had, moderated some of these positions, and I think we can expect that Europe will find more consideration of a future German government.
That's a really interesting view. Ursula, what do you make of that? Because this does seem to be an accusation that's constantly levelled at Angela Merkel, that she's just not bold enough with her decisions.
So I would not be so negative, but of course we can say she was a very good crisis manager, also on the European level. But on the other side, some of the crises she managed later quite successfully, she made themselves, and she was at least in a part responsible for some of the crises. For example, for the migration crisis, I think that was of course not the reason that we had the crisis, was not her fault, but the way that she looked too late at this crisis, that she wasn't aware enough of the interests of other member states of the European Union. I think she made a lot of mistakes with regard, especially to the migration crisis. So she was sometimes one of the producers of crises, but at least she managed to solve the crisis once again.
It's really interesting because, Merkel is seen as such a larger-than-life character. Matthew, she's sometimes accused, though, of not offering a strong enough lead in Europe. She's accused of being reactive, not proactive. Ursula used the word there, a crisis manager. What do you think of that?
Well, I think I pretty much categorically disagree with my esteemed colleagues. I think she's been a very good chancellor for Germany, and she's been very good for Europe. During the time when she's been in office, yes, there was the Greek crisis, and that was based on faulty economics. We know that austerity policies don't really work. In the case of Ukraine, she was the one who went to Russia, spoke Russian, and stopped Putin in his tracks. During the world economic crisis in 2008, she was the one who coordinated the response. And I think it's actually quite a positive thing that we have politicians who aren't bold, who don't go off like firecrackers and go off on wrong theories. In democratic societies, everything is part of a negotiation. And we have here a politician who's been basing her political philosophy on pragmatic policies and not on polarizing politics. Politics is, somebody famously said in Germany, where you distinguish between friend and enemy. And she has taken, in some ways, the bold step of taking politics out of policymaking. That has had a number of political implications in Southern Europe, but I think mainly they're the right ones. So I think it's the right time for her to go, because you shouldn't have chancellors that last for too long. And it's been a general problem in Germany that we have chancellors who slightly overstayed their welcome. But then again, she wanted to step down in 2017, and it was only because Barack Obama persuaded her that she had to stay, because there had to be somebody who could be the figurehead of liberal internationalism while Trump was mismanaging America. So in some ways, she's taken one for the team there, and I think that's entirely positive.
Well, let me throw that back to Stefan, that she has been a good negotiator. She's very good at managing other world leaders. She does compromise when she has to, because she took on the debt-sharing part of the pandemic recovery package, which she has always been very opposed to, but she did compromise on that when necessary. And seen as a very humanitarian, very moral leader. Her position on the Syrian refugees in 2015, for example, when she chose not to close Germany's border. So do you agree with anything that Matthew has said, that she has been good for Europe?
I think the greatest advantage about Merkel is that she is smart. And she's capable of seeing also when things need to be acted upon, and she has learned from situations, including from her own mistakes. I wouldn't agree with the view that you need a bold leader, and I don't think she was. I don't think it was leadership as such which was the problem with Merkel in Europe. The problem was that she comes from a culture in East Germany which didn't give her the normal European, how should I say, socialization that West European politicians naturally have from childhood on. And so her instincts were not European, and her instincts were more nationalistic, in fact. And in the early years of her chancellorship, she was really opposed. But, for example, she's never really positively responded to the reform agenda that Macron has put forward. And when it was really things were at the brink, when Draghi, for example, helped to save the euro, whatever it takes, then she aligned herself. The same is true about the rescue fund after the pandemic. But you should not underestimate the important role that, for example, Mr. Scholz had as a finance minister in setting this up. And the worst years were the years when she was having a coalition with the Liberals and Schäuble was the finance minister. That was really a time when Europe was at the brink of falling apart. And that had something to do with a political will rather than with leadership.
OK, so you mentioned Olaf Scholz there, who is a possible future chancellor of Germany after the upcoming elections. Let's talk about what the EU needs from the next German chancellor. Under Merkel, Germany's been accused of not being ambitious enough on EU policy. Piotr Buras, the senior policy fellow on the European Council on Foreign Relations, said Merkelism is no longer sustainable. Merkel may have adroitly managed the status quo across the continent, but the challenges that Europe faces now, the pandemic, climate change, geopolitical competition, require radical solutions, not cosmetic changes. The EU needs a visionary Germany. Ursula, if not Merkelism, then what does Europe need from Germany's next chancellor?
I'm not so convinced whether this idea of a visionary Europe is really a realistic one with regard to all member states. So I think besides perhaps France, there are not so many visions with regard to Europe, but there is a lot of nationalism and there's a lot of attitudes against the European Union. So, of course, we wish, many people wish for themselves and for the future of Europe to have a better climate policy and to have more solidarity. But when we have a look at the member states, we don't see a lot of governments which are really fond of this idea. So we need somebody in ahead of the German government, the French government, whatsoever. We need somebody who has the idea of European future and things which have to be done besides the nation state and on a European level. But we need somebody also who is able not only to have an idea, but to have this integration potential, to integrate those member states who are not so fond anymore of European visions on the one side.
Let me just ask you this, Ursula, because the two contenders for the chancellorship right now, Armin Laschet and Olaf Scholz, they both support EU integration. They both support better coordination on things like digitalisation, pandemic response and so on. So does that mean that whatever leader we're likely to get for Germany, we're not going to see changes in terms of less integration? There is going to be a push for more coordination.
Yes, I think so. There is now such a big difference between Scholz and Laschet with regard to European policy. Both of them are very fond of European policy. They want to have a little bit more integration. So I don't see such a big difference between both of them. There might be a difference with regard to foreign policy, but either that's not so big difference.
Matthew, I'll come to you in just a moment, Stefan. I just wanted Matthew to answer one point that's been made, that thus far, German approach to EU policy has been pretty nationalistic. It's been about looking after its own policy. So, for example, when it comes to Russia, Germany has one eye on the Nord Stream pipeline, for example. And Russia, China, climate change, these are some of the challenges facing the EU. Do you think Germany's approach to those could alter in the future?
I think it's highly unlikely that they will alter. And also the German approach to Russia and indeed to China is in some ways inconsistent. But I think that is politics. I think in the energy policies, because they are phasing out nuclear power, they have to have another source of energy. But at the same time as that, Merkel has been one of the people who've been most critical of Vladimir Putin. It's been a running theme during her chancellorship. I think Germany's foreign policy is more an economic foreign policy. When it comes to so-called high politics, military things and all of that, that is pretty much left to the French. But the German policy internationally has been much more to do with finance. And that's actually a thing that I think Scholz has not been given credit for. It was Olaf Scholz, who negotiated with the G7 countries a global corporate minimal tax rate. So he, in many ways, and she then was sort of credited with that. Scholz has been in the forefront of that economic foreign policy in the past 4 years. And I think that will continue if he were to become chancellor after the election. So I think it's going to be in that way more of the same. I don't think there's another appetite for a more sort of, if you like, interventionist foreign policy or activist foreign policy. I think that's just not on the cards. I think also, if I can just come back to what was talked about before, I think the idea that people say we need a bold leader, more European vision, well, frankly, whenever that's been put to the voters, they've rejected it. There is no appetite around Europe for that. And I think under Merkel, the idea of a federal super state or a United States of Europe has fallen by the wayside.
So, Stefan, I cut you off earlier. Apologies for that. But what do you think Europe needs from Germany's next chancellor?
Well, first of all, I want to say that our discussion here is about Germany and Europe. And of course, policy making in Europe is much more complex than just one of the member states, even if it's an important one. But secondly, if we look at Germany, I mean, you asked the question about who are the contenders and what are their attitudes. There are actually three contenders, not only two, because the chairwoman of the Green Party is also officially a contender for chancellorship. And the debates have been structured around that in the electoral campaign. Now, what is interesting is that on a personal level, all three of them are really very pro-European. But, and I think that's something one needs to really take into consideration, the question is who is standing behind them? What kind of coalition will be the future government? If Laschet, for argument's sake, would become chancellor, he has the Christian Democrats, the conservatives, and they are fiscal conservatives, and that is much more difficult stand than, let's say, what Scholz has done over the last 4 years as finance ministers. If we get a new coalition where Scholz is chancellor, the Green are the main coalition partner, then, or maybe the only one even, who knows, then you would get a very pro-European policy making set up in Germany. If the Liberal Party would join as a third coalition partner and let's say their leader is becoming finance minister, it will be more conservative and maybe more restrictive. But all in all, I think the future setup will be in such a way that it will become much more what used to be the German attitude towards Europe, which is pro-integration, and that is an attitude that severely was suffering under Merkel.
Yeah, but don't you think that the German public has changed their attitude towards the European Union? I'm not so optimistic with regard to a pro-EU position, more pro-EU than in the past, because the German public changed their opinion towards the EU. There is more negative attitude. We have East Germans who are not so fond of the European Union. We have a whole German public not fond of paying too much money to other member states.
So you think...
Yeah, but that's where leadership comes in. And you see, publics change their mind all the time. Look at Italy. A few years ago, they were anti-European. Now they have a pro-European prime minister, and they are pro-European
because they've got a lot of money of the EU.
Well.
Then it's easier to become pro-European than if the idea is that they have to pay for it. I think that's a difference between Germany and Italy.
And also in Italy, the polls indicate that Salvini's party is the largest of Fratelli d'Italia, which is overtly fascist, frankly. It's the second largest.
Yeah, but are they in government? That's the question in here.
Well, look, let's talk about Germany's position in the EU after Merkel's departure. The European Council on Foreign Relations did a poll recently ahead of Germany's elections. Interestingly, 52% of Germans see their own nation as a declining power. 34% of Europeans think the best is behind the country. That's Austria, Hungary, Poland, Italy, Netherlands, France, Bulgaria and Denmark. Most Spanish respondents think Germany's golden age is happening right now. But Bulgaria and Hungary had the largest proportion of people believing the country's best times are still to come. Stefan, clearly some disagreement on how influential Germany will continue to be. Does that mean there's an opportunity for another player to take the helm here? France, for example.
Of course, France is important, but there are elections in May in France as well. So we will have to see what happens there. But on your main point, I think Jean Monnet, one of the founding fathers of the European Union, he made a very interesting point to Giscard d'Estaing many years ago, where he said, there are only two kinds of countries in Europe. Small countries who know they are small and small countries who don't know they are small. But you, Mr. President, have understood that France is a small country as well. And that applies to Germany in the same way.
Matthew, what do you think? Do you think the power dynamic in the EU will change after Merkel's departure?
Well, I have a slight problem here because Stefan said exactly what I was thinking, that we only have those two types of countries, the small countries and those who actually know they're small countries as well. And I think that is very important. I think there might be countries who need to be told that they're small, even if they are. And I think that's not really Germany. I think Germany actually is a country where people, in some ways, feel they're smaller than they are. I think in foreign policy, it would be welcome if Germany could play a greater role. But I think the problem with Europe is that it's many different players. But coming back to the main argument, I don't think there's really an alternative to Germany. Germany is sort of it's the only country that is of medium size in Europe, especially after Britain left. And France, of course, is not an economic power in the same way as Germany. And fundamentally, the European Union is about economic integration. Political integration hasn't quite happened, certainly not in foreign policy. So I think Germany, in some ways, is bound to lead. And for Europe to go forward in a pragmatic way requires a sort of German leadership. But the difficulty for any German leader is that when Germany starts to lead some of the smaller countries, like the Netherlands and Denmark, to a degree, also Austria and Italy, will say, no, here they go again, we don't want to be subdued by the Germans. So it's a very difficult thing to be chancellor.
Stefan, what are your thoughts on what the power dynamic could look like in the EU in the future?
Well, I agree that Germany will remain obviously one of the most important countries because it's the biggest one. But 80 million is a very small number in terms of the world population, the world economy. So the point I wanted to make also is in terms of international and foreign policy, we should not overlook the fact that the Greens, who have been out of government during the whole Merkel period, are highly critical of Russia, highly critical of human rights in China, and that will change something in the future.
Ursula, a lot's going to depend on what the coalition's going to look like of the next German government. Do you foresee changes? I mean, there are so many challenges facing the EU, EU reform and climate change and the approach to Russia, the approach to China. Do you see changes in EU policies?
I think the necessity for changes, but I see on the other side, of course, I see a European population in different member states who are trying to be slower with regard to the integration, and I see a lot of heterogeneity in the EU, and I think it's very important for the next chancellor, for the next German government, to have talks not only with France and with Poland, but also with the smaller states, with Hungary. So we have not only the problems with regard to climate policy and with regard to foreign policy, to security policy, but we have also a lot of problems inside the European Union. How do we deal with countries, with member states who only want to have the money of a European Union, but who don't want to have the same virtues, who don't want to have the same policy with regard to liberal standards? And I think that's another big problem to be solved in Europe. We cannot have the progress with regard to foreign policy, with regard to human rights in China or in Russia and climate change when we are very different points of view with regard of the idea being a European Union. I think so. We have different agendas, the internal agenda, and that's so important for the progress with regard to the foreign relations. And so it has to be integrated both. And so that's not only the task of one government, of course. So we need several member states. And we have, of course, we already talked about it, that we have the problem that we have elections in France next year, and we will have a campaign against the European Union in France, also, of course, a pro-European campaign. But we won't see France really be helpful on the side of Germany for some months at least.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you all. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Roundtable. Stefan Collignon, Ursula Munch and Matthew Qvortrup, thank you. And you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. For now, from me and all the team here, bye-bye. Thanks for watching.